All right, so leaked CCTV footage from an Israeli channel, news channel 12 in Israel, shows a group of Israeli soldiers gang raping a Palestinian hostage at Sde Taiman. So if you guys remember this story, that a Palestinian hostage was raped at Sde Taiman, which is a prison, and that that prisoner ended up in the hospital, which was really awful. And then there were a bunch of protesters. They rounded up these Israeli soldiers. They arrested 10 of them for this crime, saying, you guys are, this is a heinous crime. We've got to arrest you. Then when they were arrested, a bunch of protesters tried to break them out, essentially, went to where they were being held, protested. It became a giant scandal in the country. Many people were supportive of these soldiers who were gang raping Palestinian prisoners. Yeah, they were supportive. And they defended the soldiers and said, how dare you arrest them? These are our heroes, they said. And that was the common sentiment in Israel, not a fringe outlier group, but the common sentiment in the state of Israel has been, so what? Let them. In fact, their Knesset debated it, saying, what exactly is the problem? Why can't they rape prisoners? These are bad guys. This is Hamas. They deserve what they get. And if we give it to them, that's what they get. Now, the world didn't really like that so much and has been speaking out against this. And so Israel's had kind of no choice but to actually address this. They had to arrest those prisoners. However, I mean, the soldiers, they had to arrest the soldiers, but 10 of them were arrested. There's only 5 of them left now. 10 were detained in the case, but then last week prosecutors dropped their demand to extend the detention to 2 of them. Then 3 soldiers who were suspected of the sexual abuse, they were released from custody on Sunday, and now 5 soldiers remain, and they're being held in the high-profile abuse case with a military court. So that is happening. They're still investigating is what they're saying. However, Channel 12, Israel's Channel 12, got a hold of some CCTV footage. I want you to watch this. This is of them raping the detainees. They are using these... they're putting up their riot shields to hide their actions. So you're not seeing exactly what's happening, but you can see what they're doing, but you can't really see it. So this isn't something, you're not going to see anything too terrible, gruesome. It's not graphic, I guess is what I should say. It's terrible. It is gruesome. It's just not graphic. So let's watch this video.
עיניהם מכוסות. הנה כאן קבוצה של חיילי המילואים מכוח 100. יחידה המשמשת להבטחת המתקן. הם לוקחים את המחבל, הנה הם כאן בפינת המתקן, כנראה מודעים למצלמות האבטחה, ומנסים להסתיר מעשיהם במגינים. הצילום כולל תיעוד של העבירה מיוחסת לאנשי המילואים, מעשה סדום בנסיבות אינוס. שעות אחר כך פונה המחבל לבית החולים מדמם. הפציעות שלו הוגדרו מורכבות. הקביעה הרפואית חד משמעית. הפציעות נגרמו מהחדרה של חפץ.
So from that footage, it does look like there's more than 5 who are engaged in this, and maybe this footage will actually change things and they'll arrest more people who are working at that Sde Taiman facility. There have been numerous reports saying that people have been tortured there. It is a torture chamber. There's a big piece that came out. We're actually going to cover a lot of the crimes on Friday. We do have a guest that is coming on who knows very well the crimes that Israel's been committing. Adar Weinreb, he's been on the show before, and he's going to be talking more extensively about the crimes and the recent reports from these IDF soldiers. So it's just absolutely terrible. But this is what we're supporting. We're supporting this, and they are now being called out for it. They are somewhat doing something about it. Matthew Miller did answer this question at the State Department today. Watch this.
Going back to Israel, Israeli media today released a video showing Israeli soldiers raping a Palestinian detainee at Sde Taiman detention camp. The footage was very disturbing. I know you have commented on the reports about this detention center before, but we now have a new evidence, which is video. Have you seen that video, and do you have anything to say on that, and also the reports of rape in Israeli prisons?
So we have seen the video, and reports of sexual abuse of detainees are horrific. They ought to be investigated fully by the government of Israel, by the IDF. Prisoners need to be treated, prisoners' human rights need to be respected in all cases. And when there are alleged violations, the government of Israel needs to take steps to investigate those who are alleged to have committed abuses and, if appropriate, hold them accountable. And it is appropriate that the IDF, in this case, has announced an investigation, has arrested a number of people who are alleged to have been involved. And I won't speak to the outcome of that investigation, but it ought to proceed swiftly. And if they're determined to be in violation of criminal laws or violations of the IDF's code of conduct, then of course they ought to be held accountable.
And actually, this is not the first rape incident we have been hearing about Israeli prisons. And Israeli human rights group B'Tselem on Monday released a report saying that Sede is only tip of the iceberg, and that Israeli detention centers turned into a network of torture camps for Palestinians. It reports cited testimonies from 55 Palestinian detainees. So I know the Israelis are investigating this, but would you support an independent investigation into those allegations?
So I would have to look at what the specific independent investigation people are calling for and pass judgment on the merits. But look, there ought to be zero tolerance for sexual abuse, rape of any detainee, period. That's a fundamental it's a fundamental belief of the United States. And if there are detainees who have been abused, if they are detainees who have been sexually assaulted or raped, the government of Israel and the IDF need to fully investigate those actions and hold anyone responsible accountable to the full extent of the law.
Just a final one on that. What is your reaction to that? Israelis, including politicians and lawmakers, protested actually the arrest of Israeli soldiers who are suspected of abuse and rape. And, we have also seen comments from Israeli lawmakers trying to justify the, rape of Palestinians. Have you seen those remarks?
So obviously, with respect to the last question, there is no justification for rape of anyone. As I said, there must be zero tolerance for sexual assault of detainees. And with respect to comments that have been made by people in the Israeli government, or protests or attempts to interfere with the judicial system, the military judicial system in Israel, our principle, the principle that we believe ought to apply in Israel, is a principle that ought to apply anywhere in the world, and that is that the rule of law needs to hold. And so we have seen the statements by the IDF Chief of Staff that these investigations are important, that they are going to continue, and that is fully appropriate.
So the rule of law should hold, except when it comes to the International Criminal Court. I'm just saying, right? That's when then we just shove that aside. We don't even pay any attention to it whatsoever. But this is look, the Israelis, it's a big question on whether or not they're going to really truly do much about this with these soldiers who are raping these prisoners, doing various acts of torture against these prisoners. The truth is that the society is on the side of the soldiers. They think the soldiers are heroes. They don't want to hear about this. They don't care about Hamas. They've already demonized them and dehumanized them and turned them into animals, and they don't care anything about them. And so there is a big question as we follow this case, whether or not anything's truly going to be done, or if public pressure in Israel is going to cause the judicial system to essentially crumble under that pressure. So we'll definitely continue to be watching that. But it's just a sickening, terrible story. War brings out the worst in people. And certainly in this situation, when an entire group of people have been reduced to less than humans, this is how they treat them. I understand there's a lot of anger, and that people have a lot of anger about October 7th, but that doesn't, we don't believe that you can then take that out in these torturous ways against people. Now, Smotrich, he is the finance minister of Israel. He actually said this the other day. He says it may be justified to starve 2 million Gazans, but the world won't let us, is what he says. We actually have the video of him, and this is subtitled, so you'll have to read it, but this is what he says in the full context. Watch this. Oh, do we not have the sound on this? Okay. So he's saying that what he's saying is that they have to bring in humanitarian aid. He says it's not possible with the international community. No one would. I'm going to actually pause this. I'm going to go back. I'm going to read to you guys then exactly what is being said. So he says right here, fact is, Hamas controls the humanitarian aid today. That is their fuel. That's their oxygen. That is the most essential component of this war. Had we assumed the responsibility of the humanitarian aid effort already 6 months ago, and we would let in humanitarian aid because there's no choice, it is not possible within the international reality of today to conduct a war. No one would let us starve and thirst 2 million civilians, although it might be just and moral until they return our hostages. Humanitarian in return of humanitarian. It is morally right, but there's nothing to do. We live today inside of a space, and we need international legitimacy for this war. Fact is, so that's what he's saying, is that it's just, and it would be moral and just for us to starve 2 million people. He's saying, because look, they won't let our hostages go. So our tactic should have been to starve them and to not give them humanitarian aid. We don't need to give them humanitarian aid until they give us our hostages back. And because they won't, we should be able to starve them to death. And they should just die of thirst and starvation. But it turns out the world won't let us do it, is what he essentially said. The scariest thing about this statement is that when this was posted on social media, so many Israelis agreed with him. They said, well, yeah, if they're not going to give us our hostages back, then we'll just starve them. So 2 million people are not holding those hostages, right? There's a group, a governmental body, a political body, a militia group inside of that 2 million that is holding the hostages. The average person in Palestine, 2 million people, imagine the size of that. That's the size of a large city in America. And how many of those people in that large city in America do you think have anything to do with policy, anything to do with government? They can't even get basic things done in their communities, like get the homeless list cleaned up or a street light fixed or road repairs, right? So the average person has absolutely no power whatsoever. And what Smotrich is saying, he's the finance minister. He's a man in power. And he's saying, well, we should be allowed to starve them to death, but the world won't let us do it. It's not, that would be wrong. We, of course, would never consider that. We want to hold the people responsible for holding the hostages. We want to target them. We want to get our hostages back. That's the way we go about doing this. We don't punish an entire group of 2 million people for the actions of a few. That's not what he's saying. No, he instead says, well, we would if we could, but we can't because the world's watching and they won't let us. That is where the Israeli mentality has reeled into. And when this is posted on social media, so many Israelis said, yeah, well, I agree with them. And there were some Israelis who spoke out and said, this is disgusting. This is terrible. And people said, well, you're disgusting and you're terrible for thinking that this is disgusting and terrible. This is right and just and the way it should be. And let those Palestinians die until they give us what we want. That's the mentality. And this is the mentality of when you are trying to create an ethnostate, it always leads to genocidal thinking. There's no way around it. Now, I'm not talking about maintaining an ethnostate. That's a little bit different, although that does lead to racism. But creating an ethnostate when there's in an area where people already exist, people are already there who are not part of the ethnicity that you're trying to create, that always leads to genocidal thinking. There is no way for it to not. It always leads to that. That's why it's an abhorrent ideology. That's why we don't allow it to flourish here in the United States. Not that we don't allow it, because people just reject it. People reject the idea that the United States should be an Aryan nation. We think that's wrong. There are people here in the United States who believe that, but they're fringe. They're in small groups living in rural, someplace in the country, and they're not powerful voices. People don't agree with that. Genocidal thinking stems from that ethnostate, the desire to create an ethnostate when there are others who are already there. And that is what's happened to Israel. They have reeled into genocidal thinking. The only way you can create an ethnostate when other people are there is if you demonize them, you dehumanize them, you turn them into evil non-animals that you're allowed to slaughter, you're allowed to treat however you want, that they just need to go away because you've got a project that you're trying to go forward with, and that is an ethnostate. Now, if you already have an ethnostate, and you want to maintain that ethno-state. We see that a lot in a variety of countries, Japan being one of them. There's other countries that are here in the United States. We see this throughout Europe. We see some people, more and more voices. I think it's much more of a popular movement where they're starting to talk about, we want Europe to remain white. We don't want all these Arabs here. We want the United States to remain Christian, and we don't want all these others here. That sort of ideology is when you're trying to maintain. Now, obviously in the United States, we're way beyond that point of trying to maintain an ethno-state. But in Europe, they're saying, well, what about Sweden? They could have maintained an ethno-state had they done that, but they chose not to. So when you're trying to maintain an ethno-state, the problem with that is that humans are naturally migratory. Throughout all of human history that we know of, humans have moved around the world. That's how we populated the world. We moved around. So humans are naturally migratory. So when people migrate into your region and they're not you, they're not part of your ethnicity, they're others, then the desire to maintain that ethno-state turns into racism. People are then treated like others. They're never accepted. They're never assimilated in. They can be outcast. They could be deported. We start saying things like, we want to deport you. We want to get rid of you. That leads to racism, but it doesn't necessarily lead to genocide, depending on how far gone that nation is and whether or not, if there's already a lot of others there, and then they start having like, well, we want to maintain it. Once you're beyond the point of maintenance, once you already have a bunch of people who are not part of your ethnicity already there, maintenance would really be sort of like the, when they were trying to stop the virus from spreading, right? They were trying to close down borders and say, we don't want anybody here with the virus. And so it'd be a similar sort of, you'd have to go into a lockdown sort of situation, similar to Japan, where you don't allow certain people to immigrate in just from the get-go. They're able to do it. They're an island. It's a lot easier to close off your borders when you're an island. So Japan is an example of a country that has been able to maintain an ethno-state pretty well, certainly without genocide, because they didn't take over the island. Well, maybe if you go way back in history, I haven't studied Japanese history long enough. So those of you who know it, but let's assume it's always been Japan. Japan's always been Japan, that the people there are the native indigenous people there. And they just populated more and more and more. And they're an island, so it's easy to keep people away. And so they're able to control their borders easier. So when people try to immigrate in, they say, well, if you're not really Japanese, you can't, we're not really going to give you citizenship. You can live here, you can be a permanent resident, but you can't be a citizen. You're not Japanese. That's one thing. It's still racist to say that to somebody, but if you're trying to maintain a certain culture, you're trying to preserve a certain ethnicity, there could be a debate there, an open debate on whether or not that's wrong. Once you're beyond that point, though, and a giant chunk of your population, a large chunk of it is now from other places because they migrated in. And now you're saying, after they've already migrated in, we want to maintain an ethno-state. You're beyond the maintenance point. You're now back into creation mode. You're wanting to go back to the way things were by creating that ethno-state, which means you're going to have to expel people one way or the other. One way being you could deport them, you could expel them, you could banish them, or you could kill them, right? You could genocide them. But if you are like Israel and you're wanting to create an ethno-state in a region where other people were living before you got there, and then you showed up and you said, hey, by the way, this was ours 3,000 years ago, we're back, and we want to take it back for ourselves, and you're clearing the land, there's no way to do that other than through a genocide or through mass expulsion. That's what they've been doing, both of those. And that's the only way to get that done. And that is an ideology that we say is abhorrent. We didn't even like it when the Germans wanted to go to an Aryan nation, which they could argue was maintaining an ethno-state, not creating. They say, well, German was white. We were always blonde and blue-eyed. And suddenly all these people came in and they're different than us. The gypsies, the Romans, the Jews, they're different. We don't like them. We don't want them here. We want to maintain an Aryan nation. By then, they'd gone way beyond the maintenance point because there were already a lot of people there. And so once you get to that point and you start saying, well, let's get back to the way things were, we want it like the good old days, they ended up, that's recreating, I would call it recreating the ethno-state. And when you get into any sort of creation of ethno-state, you end up with genocidal thinking. That's the only way you're going to get to an ethno-state, either creating it or recreating it. And maintaining it, that's tricky because even with maintenance, you do have to block people from coming in, which is against human nature. We are migratory creatures. So you'd have to block them from coming in. You'd have to block them from living and giving them equal rights. And that would be racist. That is racist. We don't believe in that here in the United States. There are other countries around the world who certainly maintain their ethnic, you got a lot of the Middle Eastern countries that do that. Obviously some Asian countries do that, but by and large, that does result in a very racist mentality, a racist ideology, and it's wrong. The Vietnam War, when it ended, I thank God every day I was born here in the United States. Had I been born in Vietnam, my mother would have been killed for having a child with an American, with a white person, and I would have been put in a labor camp, and I would have been killed. And that is racist. It's a racist ideology to say we don't want others here. Others are different from us. They're an enemy of us. We don't want them around. That leads to racism every single time, and it leads to killings, and it leads to genocide. And that is where Israel is, unfortunately, in their mentality, because they've all been bred from the time they were born into believing that that was their land. It didn't belong to anybody else, that they're trying to create a Jewish nation for Jews, not for all the people living in the Holy Land, but instead just for Jews. It would have been one thing if they would have gone there and said, we want sovereignty and independence, right? From the Ottomans, from the Brits, from anybody else coming around. We want to make an independent country, and all the people living on the land, we are an independent country now. We are a sovereign, independent nation. We're under no empire. That would have been one thing, but that's not what they did. They, in fact, relied on the empire to help them create an ethnostate, and then went about cleansing the land. And that is just absolutely wrong. And many of, we get called anti-Semitic for saying these types of things when I've got no skin in the game. I'm not Muslim. I'm not Jewish. I'm not Arab. I'm not Middle Eastern at all. I've got no dog in this fight. But I'm a human, and I can I can logically see situations. I can see right and wrong, that's for sure. And I can see that this ethnostate and the creation of an ethnostate is wrong. I wasn't always there, though, right? There was a time where I thought, well, okay, the Jews should be able to have their own nation. I think that's fair. That's fine. And that is fair and fine. If Jews want to have their own nation, I have nothing against that. It just can't be created in a place where other people already exist. If you could find an island somewhere or a block of land where nobody lives, and you could carve that out and say, this is now your home, by all means, till the land and build your homes and build up economy and do all of those things. I have nothing against that at all. That would be great. We see we see that type of thing happen. And even on a very small scale, when we see little neighborhoods pop up that are kind of like their own little villages in the United States, they do those kind of fun little, whatever, but you get what I'm saying. I don't have any problem with that. So as long as nobody was already there. Once somebody else is there and you try to kick them out, you're now genocidal, and you're racist, or you're both. And that's not a good way to be. Hey guys, this was just a clip of a longer show. Catch the full show by going to KimIversonShow.com. It is free. It airs Monday through Friday, 5 p.m. Pacific, 8 p.m. Eastern. You could go back now and watch this full interview. I highly recommend it. Again, go to KimIversonShow.com. Thank you so much for watching.